Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of our summer term lecture series. Really nice to have you all back with us, and really delighted this evening to welcome Simon Bill. Now, Simon was actually due to visit us way back in 2020 before the pandemic. It was all booked in, and then one thing led to another, and we never got round to it. So we're really pleased that Simon's agreed to come back this evening and pick up where we were meant to start before the pandemic hit us. So Simon is an artist and a writer. He trained at Central St Martin's and then went on to the Royal College of Art. He's been represented by Cabinet Gallery in London, Crown Gallery in Brussels, Bloom Gallery in Amsterdam, and Patrick Painter in Los Angeles, with solo shows at all of these galleries and others. In 2014, his first museum show, titled Lucky Jim, was held at the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art in Gateshead. And in 2016, his novel Artist in Residence was published by Sort of Books, after which he was appointed Artist in Residence at the Gulbenkian Science Institute in Lisbon between 2017 and 2018. He's currently engaged in creating a series of op art murals on the seafront in Great Yarmouth, which sound fantastic, as well as writing a book of essays about Dover, which has a working title, Lonely Dover. I'm sure Simon will tell us when that's due to be published later on. So tonight, Simon's going to be speaking about visual perception, a really significant and growing field within neuroscience, and for many years, something that figured strongly within the theory portion of education in fine art. Now, Simon's talk seeks to reintroduce visual perception to the discourse of contemporary art, and he's going to present a survey of the subject as it now stands. So Simon, if you're there, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Really lovely to have you with us after all these years, and we're really looking forward to hearing you speak this evening. Simon should be emerging from the Zoom ether any moment.
There we go.
Hi. There we go. Hi, Simon. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. I'm here, yeah. Okay, can everybody hear me yet?
Yeah, loud and clear, thanks.
Okay, so I just start then. Should I open up my presentation? So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I need to rock through this. It's actually quite a lot to look at. I'm going to start with a selection of images and ideas from the culture at large to do with this subject, visual perception. I found in the past, when I've gone to art schools to talk about visual perception, quite a lot of people who work in art schools don't know that it's a subject at all. And so some of the images I'm about to show you will be familiar to people who thought that they didn't know what it was. So I'm going to go right into the first one, and when I can see my... Oh, there we go. Have you all got the title of the lecture now?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Simon. Joys of Zoom. All good.
Good, okay. So there's a Kafka quote. This is from some early research into facial recognition. It was, what they were doing was they were getting hold of images of famous people and manipulating them to see what changes would have an effect on one's ability to recognize the face. That the reasons for doing this kind of research is partly medical reasons. There's a condition, a neurological condition called prosopagnosia, which is face blindness, which is it's caused usually by a stroke. Some sort of brain damage will cause you to be unable to recognize faces. Everybody's face will look the same to you. The other reason is not medical, it's to do with surveillance. We're all now familiar, this was obviously in the 80s, if you recognize the image, it's Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister. They were just guessing at possibilities for facial recognition software in those days, which is now ubiquitous. This isn't the version, but this image from research started to circulate outside of science. This is actually the version that circulated, and it was circulating not because of the interest in neuroscience, it's because of a kind of inadvertent political satire. The image on the left was thought to reveal the real nature of the person within. These beautiful images are pictures, are colour wheels, which was a kind of craze for colour theories in the 19th century. By the way, there's no order to all these examples, are meant to be come from all over the place. There was numerous colour theories that arose in the 19th century, and with each theory came a colour wheel or a colour chart of some sort associated with it. Artists were starting to look at them with hope of optimizing their colour effects. The most famous one, most influential one, is the one second from the left at the top, by Chevreau. Chevreau is famous for, or known for, a couple of things. He came up with the idea there's such a thing as complementary colours, which seems obvious to us now, but it was new at the time. And he's also famous for doing something for understanding the importance of context in colour. He got hired by a dyeing firm who supplied a tapestry manufacturer. The manufacturers were complaining that the dyes on the threads were fading, and Chevreau was hired to look into this. He discovered they weren't fading at all. But what simply was that the colour, one colour is put next to affects how it looks. So colours appeared to fade simply because of what they were put next to, which again seems obvious to us, but at the time it was new news. Amongst the artists who were reading Chevreau and his other colour theorists, well, the artist who took it most seriously, was known to take it most seriously, is Georges Seurat, the Seurat painting. And you'll see in art history books, textbooks about Seurat, that he used optical blending. The idea was that instead of blending colours on the palette, he would use the same principle you get in colour printing now, or on the screens you're looking at, or televisions. You had dots of primary colours, and given in different densities, they would give different colours. Actually, if you look at a Seurat painting close up, you'll see that he actually wasn't really doing that. He was mixing the colours on the palette and just applying them like as any other artist would have done. Any of the impressionist artists, for example. So it's sort of it illustrates some of the difficulties associated with the idea of applying theory directly to practice. Paintings are still great, but he wasn't doing what he was alleged to have been doing. His work wasn't as directly informed by science as it seems to have been. Another artist whose work is also associated with, there are only two real movements associated with visual perception, and it's pointillism, Seurat, and op art, of which Bridget Riley here is the most well-known practitioner. And it's often said of her work that they are optical illusions. So mostly, I would say, not really optical illusions, they are geometric abstraction. Here's an example of a painting of hers that actually is a sort of optical illusion. It's what's called a moire effect. Moire is a kind of fabric where threads of different colours, when woven, will seem to shudder or shimmer. This is dazzle camouflage. This was it was in the First World War. They were attempting to our ships were being sunk by U-boats regularly, and this was a kind of, it's called camouflage, but you can't actually hide an entire ship in the sea. So the idea of it was that it was supposed to make the position and course of a ship so difficult to assess that it, when viewed through a periscope by a U-boat captain, they would aim incorrectly. So at one point, about half of it, so each ship was painted with a different pattern of this sort. It had to be, for it to work. At one point, about half the British fleet was painted like this. These are by Marcel Duchamp, obviously a very important figure of the 20th century, and it was both a business venture and some research into visual perception. He was interested both in business and in visual perception. And what it was is you buy a box of these cards, and this device, this roto relief machine, and when fixed to the machine, the image in the middle would appear to pop into 3 dimensions, pop it right out of two. There's not as much known about this as I think there probably should be. Anyway, it's a serious, an interesting feature of Duchamp's work. The effect, by the way, is called stereokinetic depth. This was a meme, or an image distributed on the internet called Ninio's extinction illusion, devised by a man called Jacques Ninio. And you'll find on this grey grid, there are 12 black dots, but you can never see more than 4, sometimes 5. They tend to disappear from view. And it's to do with, or it's thought to be to do with, a phenomenon in visual perception, a neural mechanism called filling in. Your eyes don't collect at once all the information you seem to be viewing at any one time. What happens is that your eyes dart about and collect fragment bits, and your experience of vision is of actually a composite of collected bits of information assembled into a composite. And the mechanism underlying your ability to the brain's ability to do this, the visual brain's ability to do this, filling in, works best with either uniform surfaces, obviously, or with patterns. And what seems to be happening here is that, I mean, what's happening is you can't actually see the whole of the grid at the same time, but you remember most of it. And that works very well because of it being a pattern, a grey grid. And the black dots are just far enough apart so that they don't register as a pattern. And so they, as it were, they disappear because you are, as it were, forgetting them. We'll come back to this. I know it's a very counterintuitive idea. Another internet meme, the dress. This circulated a lot because it's about half and half. Half the people who see this photograph, it's taken at a wedding in Scotland. Half people see it as a white and gold dress. Half people see it as a blue and black dress. And whichever group you belong to, you can't imagine how anybody could see it the other way. And as with so many of these things, the effect is fully explained, but it does demonstrate one important thing about vision, which is that it relies on decisions being made unconsciously by the brain. The image seems to rely exactly on a kind of fault line between 2 equally likely interpretations of what's being looked at. Another one you may well have seen is experimenting into inattentional blindness. So these are stills from a film that was made of people passing a ball to each other, and it was part of an experiment in which the subjects were asked to count how many times the ball passed from one person to another. They were then asked if they'd seen a person in a gorilla suit move across the scene, and only about 50% had. You see what you're paying attention to, basically. This is a neural network, Google Deep Dream, and it's a it's kind of software that it mimics something in the biology of perception, which is that preferences give emphasis to certain features such that you will see things in a certain way. So with this, an image, the image you see in the top left, some jellyfish, has passed through Deep Dream a number of times with the rule, the law, look for dogs, or look for anything that's ambiguous, interpret as a dog or part of a dog. And as the image goes through a number of iterations, you see more and more dogs. So by the time you get to, I think the one on the bottom right is 50 iterations, you start to see quite a lot of dogs. This is a it's a postcard, a kind of postcard that was part of a device called a stereoscope. It was a sort of parlour game in the Victorian times, and so the images are not identical; they're slightly different. And what happens is the card is put into the device, the stereoscope, and it pops out into 3D, vivid 3D, single image. And this is mimicking 3D vision in biology, in the eye and the brain. And in particular, two aspects of it, binocular disparity and stereopsis. Binocular disparity is the fact that the view given by each eye is not the same, disparate. And stereopsis is a neural mechanism by which the information, not the actual images, but the information from the images given by each eye is fused and combined to give a single 3D image, combining the information of those two eyes. This is another 3D sort of entertainment parlor game thing, much more recent, from the 90s. There's a sort of craze in the 90s. Magic Eye random dot autostereograms. It is two images, but they're placed on top of each other, but slightly misaligned. And then there are slight differences between the two of them. And looked at correctly, as it were correctly, which is incorrectly, if you go kind of boss-eyed, it does hurt your head, so don't try. It hurts your eyes and your head. If you either focus in front of the picture plane or beyond the picture plane, a clear 3D image will pop out of it. It doesn't resemble what you seem to be seeing without doing that at all. And again, it relies on binocular disparity. It relies on the fusion of information from the two eyes, and none of it works with one eye open. This is the last of the kind of popular culture visual perception things. So this is a quote from that very well-known key film, The Matrix, and it's where the character Morpheus gives sort of a good summary of current thinking of neuroscience of perception and visual perception. What is real? Talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste, what you can see. The real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. And here is a still from the film, and it shows the character Neo awakening and discovering that the reality he thought he was in was a sort of virtual reality supplied by that sort of thing plugged into the back of his head. Now, it is science fiction, and this is technology to do this doesn't exist, but the principle of it, the theory behind it, is absolutely sound and completely possible because of something called it's specific nerve energy. You can sort of demonstrate specific nerve energy to yourself. If you're in a dark room, you rub your eyes, you'll seem to see flashes of light. And that's because what you're doing is you're stimulating the retina, but not with light, you're just poking it, just prodding it. Because the point is that those neurons in that part of the retina is counted as part of the brain. Neurons in that part of the brain will take any stimulus at all to be light. Obviously, it's crude because it's just been prodded by your finger. But the principle is that your experience is dictated not by the stimulus, but by which part of the brain is stimulated. So parts of the brain in the visual system that are stimulated will always be experiencing vision, even if the stimulus has just been, as I say, poked. So we're now going to look at visual perception as it figures in academia and in the two branches of academia. So we're going to look at some philosophy first. As you know, or perhaps you didn't, academia is traditionally divided into the sciences and the arts and humanities. So, and visual perception is unusual in featuring in both those halves. I don't know if any other subject does it. Another thing that's traditionally divided into halves loosely is philosophy. And as an art student, you're most likely, it's usually divided into continental philosophy and analytical philosophy. And art students mainly get, when they're asked to read philosophy, it's mainly in the continental tradition. And we're going to look at one example from that. But I'm just going to quickly look at a work about perception by an analytical philosopher, Austin. This is his book, Sense and Sensibilia. And Austin was his approach was called linguistic analysis, and linguistic analysts, they didn't actually offer theories of their own about things. What they did was seek to expose faults in others' theories on the grounds that they arose from sort of uncharacteristic uses of language. So he hasn't got a theory about perception and sensibilia. He's criticising others' theories on the grounds that he thinks they aren't problems at all. So linguistic analysis, its view is that a lot of philosophical problems aren't problems at all. So, for example, they would approach the problem, what's the meaning of life? They would say, well, what does it mean, an appropriate use of the word meaning? I mean, you could say, what does chien mean? It means dog in French. Or you could say, what does that sign mean? It means man digging. But life, it's such a weird use of the word meaning as to be meaningless. So they don't solve problems. They used to say they don't solve problems, they dissolve problems. An important continental philosopher on this subject, in fact, probably the most famous book in philosophy about perception is this man's book, Maurice Merleau-Ponty's book, Phenomenology of Perception. Now, I'm going to give a sort of thumbnail definition of phenomenology before I talk about the book. It's about perception. Phenomenology comes along around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, at about the time that philosophy has kind of devolved into a number of smaller sub-subjects, a number of specializations like ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and so on. Logic, did I say that already? And it arises out of a feeling that something has gone missing by making it into this bunch of specializations, detailed specializations. Something has gone missing, and what's gone missing is that none of these things are important unless they somehow arise in experience. So surely the grounding of all philosophical thought should be experience itself. So the subject of philosophy, beginnings of philosophy, should be to study experience. So that's roughly what phenomenology is. It's philosophy about experience. Merleau-Ponty has his book is kind of a polemic against various other approaches to the subject of visual perception, scientific ones and philosophical ones. And one problem that he has both in science and with empirical philosophy is he thinks it makes it bitty. It atomizes it, is his term. So he thought it was wrong to approach the subject of perception by looking at redness or roundness or smoothness or hotness or coldness, because we don't experience things in atomic sensations. We experience whole. It comes as a complete experience. And so although he was hostile to a lot of science, there was a school of psychology, Gestalt psychology, which saw it the same way as him and with which he had a great deal of sympathy. And Gestalt is a, well, it's one of those German words that isn't very easy to translate, but it means something like wholeness. And here are the key guys. It was an influential movement, quite big, but its origins, these three, Wertheimer, Kohler, and Kafka, and they one of the things they're most known for is trying to devise some simple rules according to which they claimed all sensory perception is organized. And they actually gave a numbered list of these organizational principles, which we'll go through. There are actually different versions of the list, some of which are longer, but this is the shortest and neatest. And this is a standard illustration of one of these principles, proximity. So what they were saying, what they were arguing is that obviously these are all the same, but they can be understood to be have distinct identities, distinct characters, according to how they stand in relation to a load of other dots, identical dots. So for example, the one at the top left is like all the rest, but also it has its own identity because of its position. You can also assign identities and distinguish and organize experiences by noticing differences and similarities. Here, the differences, they're all the same size and shape, but obviously some are white and some are green, and we very easily distinguish them as belonging to these two distinct groups. So it's a basic organizational principle. Some of you may be thinking this is too obvious to think about, but remember they're trying to think about what's the most basic principles underlying all possible experience. Another organizational principle that they identified was continuity, not one to do with lines and outlines. So if you, in this illustration, it shows it pretty clearly. So when you look at the thing on the left, you tend not to see it like C as two kind of like wonky V shapes joined. You tend to see it like B as two continuous lines crossing each other. Somehow the perceptual system prefers that. It's about preferred ways of organizing things. Closure is it's simply that we have no trouble seeing these as a circle and a rectangle, even though they are complete. Our brain does the job of closing the gaps. Figure ground relationship. This is always a standard illustrations of these principles, including this one, even though it's actually it doesn't illustrate the figure ground principle very well, because the whole point of this image, Rubens' vase, is that it's ambiguous which is figure and which is ground. So if you understand it to be a vase, then obviously the white is figure. If you understand it to be two profiles, then the black is figure. Finally, this another untranslatable word, pragnans, and a standard illustration of pragnans of the Olympic symbol, and it sort of means something visually just seeming to hang together and looking right, which is sort of a mouthful, so you understand why the German word has become standard and remains untranslated. We're going to go back to that a little bit. First, we're going to just want to mention, if you've read the abstract to do this talk, I mentioned that visual perception was an important subject in art education for a long time. Post-war, up until about, I think until about the mid-70s, where it sort of disappeared. And it's become displaced by what's very loosely called critical theory. Critical theory isn't interested in the sort of basic conditions of seeing or encountering anything. It's interested in socio-political aspects of things, what they mean. I'm not going to say very much more about this book. It was a standard textbook in art schools, as far as art schools ever have standard textbooks. And if there's a library where you are, it probably has it. I mean, it's very much of its time. It's a subject that continued in art schools. It wouldn't have remained as the standard visual perception textbook by any manner of means, but it's still completely worth reading and a very rewarding book. This is just one illustration from it that I've chosen partly just because I find it aesthetically pleasing. What Arnheim calls the structural skeleton of a square. The science of visual perception. So psychology now is generally mostly what's called cognitive psychology. It emphasizes the acquisition and processing of information. So that's the approach to perception that's given in cognitive psychology. So, and it gives sort of a counterintuitive picture of perception, because we experience perception, the world around us, as coming to us whole and instantly. It's a kind of unmediated thing, and what cognitive psychology is doing is showing that it's mediated and it takes place over time, and the actual information is coming in bits, have to be assembled. And with vision, the basic evidence for the cognitivism, as it's called, is this thing called poverty of stimulus. What this means is that basically the stimulus and what stimulus seems to be giving don't match. The retina can do a lot of things. It's a marvelous instrument, but it's not collecting anything like enough information to give you what you all are now seeing. So it seems clear that a lot of what you're now experiencing visually isn't coming from your eyes, it's coming from your brain, prompted by what's coming from your eyes. The eye just collects, I like to compare it to, say you were to go into a dark room with a little mag-light torch, and you're allowed to flick it on and off, say 6 times, and then you have to describe the contents of the room. That's actually what's happening. The eye's collecting these little bits of information, and your brain is constructing the rest of it using various rules, kind of informed guesswork, unconscious rules. You don't know you're applying them, because if you do, it will take too long. This approach, cognitivism, cognitive approach to perception, was first clearly articulated and became the sort of standard approach to science with this man Hermann von Helmholtz, who's a kind of polymath, and his neat way of summarizing the approach is this: perception is unconscious inference. So it's inference based on evidence. That's an important thing to remember. So what the sense organs gather little bits of evidence, and then your brain puts it together with a picture that constructs your world. This is Ibn al-Haytham was a Muslim scholar, Islamic scholar, as you can see, that died just before the Battle of Hastings. And he's not part of a continuous tradition of what that gave rise to cognitivism, but he said this. So he basically he figured it out about 1,000 years before anyone else did. Just read through that. So that basically is saying that the perceptible world is the outcome of a rational process, a cognitive process. comes about through reason. But as I say, he had this insight, and then it was completely forgotten about until 1,000 years, until the 19th century. This is another, Richard Gregory is a sort of key figure in the study of perception in this country and in Western world generally, an experimental psychologist, and he summarized this cognitivist view in this way: perception is hypothesis. So roughly the same sort of way of saying it as von Helmholtz. Now this is Merleau-Ponty. Coming back to Merleau-Ponty, he actually strongly objected to cognitivism, the idea that the intellect plays any part at all in perception, because he was he believed in the immediate reality of all sensations, and he argues against this view here in this quote by pointing out that basically he's arguing that stereopsids, remember I mentioned before that the process by which we get 3D vision using our two eyes, is that the data from each of the eyes is combined in the brain to produce single vision, a single image that's 3D. And he's basically saying here that stereopsis is denying that it occurs at all, and his ground for denying it is because it doesn't appear in consciousness, that we don't gather information from each of our eyes, think about it, and then see in 3D. So because we're not aware of it, he's saying it can't be happening at all. Sorry. I pressed the wrong button there. And just to contrast that, here's it's from a visual perception textbook, which gives the summarizes the view that not only stereopsis, but a lot of the vision requires a cognitive process thought. And it also mentions something that we're going to look at now in a second, which is that this cognitive process uses inbuilt laws, kind of so-called hardwired laws, rules of thumb, as it were. And where rules of thumb are misapplied, this is why you sometimes get optical illusions. We're going to look at some in a moment, but first, these are textbook illustrations of the view that perception is concerned. Some from the brain, some from the sense organs. It's called the top-down, bottom-up model. So top-down means what comes from the brain, bottom-up means what comes from the eye, or the ear, or the tongue, or which sense organ is involved. And another standard illustration from a psychology textbook. Perception in the middle, between sensory input, memory, expectations, knowledge, and other. Now, this is the final section of the talk, and it's we're going to look at a load of optical illusions, which when I mention this in art schools and I look at optical illusions, I do get some sneers. People think they're trivial, which they are sort of games, and the way most of us will have encountered them, we have encountered, will be as sort of, yeah, kids things. But most of them have actually been devised by psychologists, scientists, trying to understand how vision works. And lots of them are named after the scientists who devised them. So here's a few examples that you might be aware of in the 19th century. A lot of these scientists are German as well. The Optical illusion, and it's what it is that they appear to be of different lengths. There's two lines, but actually they're the same, horizontal and vertical. Another two lines that appear to be of different lengths, which are actually the same. May or may not be the same principle underlying this, the Ponzo illusion, but this is very clearly reliant on something to do with perspective, and something called size constancy. Constancy is where the perceptual system tries to overrule temporary or fleeting effects due to unusual conditions. So what it's trying to do here is the brain knows that a faraway thing is bigger than it appears to be. So very often, so what happens in vision is that far objects are experienced subjectively larger than they appear if measured on the actual record on the retina. So basically 2 yellow lines of the same size appearing to be different. Nobody knows quite why this one works, Herring illusion, but these horizontal lines bow as they go through this kind of fanned outlines. Similar sort of a distortion illusions, the Zollner illusion. So these diagonal lines are parallel, but they appear to want to converge. Similar thing, the cafe wall illusion was discovered by Richard Gregory onto tiles on a cafe in Bristol, as it happened. Jastro's duck rabbit. This is called a bistable image. That I wouldn't really count it as an illusion personally, but it crops up and things to do with optical illusions. We're going to go into much more recent and more kind of spectacular illusions. Illusory motion. So these are all of these are by the same man, Akiyoshi Kitaoka, who I'm in touch with a bit. And one of the murals I did in Yarmouth is not from any of these images, but it was based on one of his images. And I contacted him and said, is it okay? And he said, yeah, it's good. So illusory motion. So as we will, I'm sure you've all noticed, this is a static picture that appears to rotate. So it demonstrates one very counterintuitive aspect of visual perception, which is that for an image to move, for the perception of movement to occur, actual movement isn't one of the basic requirements. What it seems to be happening is that the aspects of these images are taken to be evidence of motion. So you have a repeated element along a predictable line, a circle, here straight lines. And you also notice with these repeated elements that they have a dark side and a light side. So they seem to be stimulating the very early processing of motion in the brain. And that part of the brain is taking these repeated elements that consciously you can see as lots, as a single element, but in different places in relation to a light source. So you're sort of seeing with two parts of your visual brain at the same time with these optical illusions. You're sort of witnessing your brain at work when these work. Here is another sort of illusion devised by this man called Edward Adelson, who works at MIT. And now, if we were in a real room, I would be using a torch to point to something. So this is difficult. The horizontal kite shapes, diamond shapes, that appear to be a dark grey and a light grey, are exactly the same grey. It's more easy to illustrate it here, where it's figurative. The A and B, squares A and B, are exactly the same grey. There's a demonstration. There's another version of constancy illusion. Now the rule, the visual perception rule that's being applied here is another version of the constancy we saw with those lines. And this isn't line shape constancy, it's tone constancy. The brain, the visual brain, is recognizing that a part of the image is under shadow, and it knows that things under shadow will appear to be darker than they really are. So it just brightens it up for us. It's correcting for what it takes to be a fleeting temporary effects, so that we can, that's why it's called constancy, because it's trying to rule out things that would make things difficult, because subject to different viewing conditions, things would be, if we didn't have constancy, basically we'd be constantly misrecognizing things, because accidents of light or of angle, of distance, would disrupt your ability to recognize them. So it's ensuring a kind of consistent reality by altering some values. Lotto is the name of the man who works in London who devised this version of the constancy. He's a kind of TV media guy, Lotto. Right, this is the very last section of the talk, and the last bunch of illusions. This is called neon color spreading, which is another one I've done paintings of. And here it's a bit more controversial, but what seems to be happening, the kind of visual perception principle that the brain seems to be applying, is that it's looking for an explanation for the abrupt change. Well, I hope you're all getting that the white, with this image we're looking at now, the white of the ground that's near the blue lines also appears to be slightly blue, not as blue as the lines, but there's definitely a blue glow to it, neon color spreading. And the brain seeks an explanation for this abrupt change in the color of the lines, and the explanation it comes up with is there's a colored light, there's a spot of blue light. But in order to be consistent with that interpretation, then the light would have to be falling between the lines as well as on the lines, and it's actually coloring them in, as it were. It could also work, it's called neon color spreading, but it can also work as a sort of shadow effect. So the effect here is as if a circular shadow is falling in the middle. So in the middle of the image, it seems to be darker than on the white on the rest of the image. Finally, another neon spreading, and final image, another look at Minio's extinction illusion, and just see how many of the black dots you can see at once. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Simon. That's incredibly fascinating, and really pleased that we could get you in to share those examples with us. Really interesting, I think, for us at a drawing school to think about our eyes and our brains in that way, because we so often don't realize just how much is going on with these amazing organs of ours, and the way that the two are sort of working in sync to produce our world. And I was thinking particularly about what you said about perception and it not being direct and instant, which I think is how a lot of people perceive what we do as drawers.
It has the same instant, otherwise it would be too disorientating, but it's actually a little bit behind all the time.
And that beautiful way of thinking about us seeing as a composite of collected information, I think there's lots of parallels there between what we do and how we draw and how we build images as artists. I was just interested in your training at art school and how your interest in visual perception came through in the work that you began to make. I wondered if you could just sort of talk a little bit about the work that you make and how these ideas and how your interest in visual perception has made its way into your practice.
Well, when I was talking about Sura right at the beginning of the talk, I sort of sounded a note of caution about applying or thinking that you're applying theory to the practice of making art. Sura actually wasn't really doing what he may have thought it's hard to believe that he really thought he was applying the theory, because when he must have known he was mixing up colours on his palette and not just using dots. But there's a problem about applying theory directly to practice, such that I'm going to say I never do it. The thinking goes on in parallel with the work. At least in my studio practice, I don't. I've recently started to do these. Basically, in any painting I produce in the studio, books I read has doesn't have any direct bearing on it. They're the product of an active, thoughtful mind, but what I'm actually reading at any given time isn't at all evident in the work, and I don't think it should be. I've been doing these murals, which I don't really count as paintings. Actually, I think of them as a sort of side project, sort of educational, and they're sort of entertainment as well. I don't quite count them as painting. As the history of my interest in it, it had. I mean, well, when I was at art school, the theory, there was almost no theory of any sort at all. It was, it's taken in, I don't know what it's like at the Royal Drawing School, because you're not a state school, but in the rest of the art schools, there is the relationship of theory to practice taken very seriously and actually enforced, and students are obliged to try and show a link between some theoretical source and what they've done, what they've produced, which I think is lethal, actually. As I said earlier, that the work comes from a very active mind. It's important, but the relationship between theory and practice, well, it's actually wrong to call it art theory. It's just thinking that goes on alongside the making of art. That's why I'm interested in it. I just am.
No, wonderful, thank you. And the commissions you're working on in Great Yarmouth, do you have an end point for those? Is there a point at which they're due to be displayed, or are they an ongoing project? Well,
they're on the wall, so I mean they're on display even before they're finished, because there's members of the public going by what they're doing them, and it's been a very gratifying experience actually, because everybody says something nice. You expect hostility. So there are currently, I can circulate them in some way. There are currently 2 images. There's one, as I said, by Akiyoshi Kitaoka that I checked with him and that he was happy. And another is based on an image by, I forget his first name, but it's called the Uchi illusion, so the man's surnames. Uchi, O-U-C-H-I. If you Google Uchi illusion, you'll see roughly what it looks like. And there's funding things. It's going to be definitely another one, but hopefully there'll be a lot of them. And I'd like to keep doing them in other places. I don't even know if I class it as art, honestly.
Maybe we should just see if we have any questions from the audience. If anyone does have a question, you're very welcome to type it into the chat box or add it to the Q&A box. Nice comments coming in.
I can see one here on my screen.
Yes, yeah. You go for it, Simon, if you can see.
Ah, Charmin Caniz, I'll read it out. Oh, it says type answer. I won't type answer. Thank you all very much for this wonderful talk. You're welcome this evening. I do hope an in-person talk will be possible at some point, because these fabulous works must be. Oh, it's just praise. Well, thank you. It's not really a question.
Well, always good to hear that.
Yeah.
So there's a question here from Germana Pascal. Does it mean that different people can have a totally different perception of a painting? In fact, there is no one reality.
Oh, there is one reality. That's what your perceptual system is there to discover. It's so all these optical illusions work for everybody, and they're because we've all got the same perceptual apparatus. So it is a shared reality. You fall out with the consensus view of reality. Basically, if there's something wrong with you. So, for example, prosopagnosia, if your senses are disrupted by drugs, medical conditions. It relies on the fact that it's mediated by a perceptual apparatus doesn't mean it's not there, because we all have the same perceptual apparatus.
Okay. We've got a raised hand from Holly Whisker. I don't know if Holly, if you're there, if you want to ask a question, we can allow you to speak.
I've also got 4 on chat. I've got 4 questions. I think. Should I open them up?
Sure.
Oh yes.
I think more praise, Simon.
Yeah.
Okay. Holly doesn't have a question. Well, that brings us nearly to the hour mark. So maybe we'll say thank you very much, Simon. It's really great to have you with us after the past 3 years, and to finally hear your lecture. And thank you very much indeed for sharing with us these thoughts this evening. The lecture will be recorded and it will be available to rewatch or listen to on our website if any of you would like to touch upon anything that's been covered this evening.
Well, look, I mean, I'm aware I gave people a lot. I mean, it was very dense. There's quite a lot to think about. So people are probably trying to digest now. So if anybody on having digested it formulates a question, just get in touch, email me or something.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Simon. That's very generous. And thank you very much for joining us this evening. Really appreciate
thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks so much.